a production of South Carolina ETV.
I'm Patti Just. On this program, we're featuring John Jakes, the author of 12 consecutive bestsellers. You know him best for the 8-volume Kent Family Chronicles, the North and South trilogy, and California Gold. His newest book is called Homeland, that has a release date of July of this year. In addition, he's written some 60 works of fiction in the areas of science fiction, mystery, westerns, and books for children. He's also written nonfiction, plays, and over 200 short stories. Mr. Jakes was born in Chicago in 1932, graduated from DePauw University in 1953, and earned an MA in American Literature from Ohio State in 1954. Mr. Jakes, thank you so much for letting us visit.
Well, delighted to have you, Patti.
It seems that your challenge as a writer has been narrowing down your areas of interest.
Indeed. I spent many years writing in any number of categories. Never very successful with any one of them. I wrote a couple of dozen science fiction novels. I loved doing it. They all sank like rocks. And finally, with the Kent Chronicles, I seemed to find an audience. I'd always loved history and historical fiction, and all of a sudden I seemed to connect with a large group of readers, finally.
You started sending things out back in high school.
I sure did. I was sending, in my ignorance, I was sending handwritten science fiction stories on notebook paper, and then I read a writer's magazine that said, don't do this, you know, double-space type. And by the end of high school, I was trying to sell stories that were correctly typed.
How were your parents at that time? Were they supportive of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, my dad was a corporate man who moved around all his life with one corporation. He really didn't understand why his only son was holed up with his portable typewriter on a sunny day. He didn't hassle me about it, but he was suspicious. Finally, when I got my $25 check for that first story and showed it to him, his whole attitude changed, and he said, well, he said, I don't know how you do it, but I'm very proud of you for doing it. And ever after, he was very supportive.
Was it true that you turned to writing fiction to impress the girls?
Well, it was you know, I was not very athletic. I tended to be, as I always am, fighting a weight problem, and I was sort of Mr. Chubby in the drama club, you know, and so you wanted to get dates with attractive young women, you had to do something, and since I didn't play football, I said, well, I'll try to write.
You also thought about being an actor in those early days of college.
I did. I did a lot of it in high school and indeed on through recent years in community theater. But as soon as I began selling fiction and also finding that I had to make money for my family, the acting went by the boards. I must say it's a great benefit for the audiences of America because I was never very good, you know, like a B- C+ actor at best.
What about your very first story? It was about a man who was pitted against a diabolical toaster.
Right. It was a very simple little story, 1,500 words, called Machine. And the man had gotten the idea that inanimate objects are inhabited by souls that can be good or bad. His toaster was demonic, and his wife said, you're crazy, you know. And at the end of 1,500 words, he had his hands on the toaster, which came to life and consumed him. It was a very simple little story, and I had to rewrite it once in order to sell it.
And it did sell.
It did sell for $25 to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Wonderful editor named Anthony Boucher, himself a writer, bought it.
And that was enough to make you say, this could be a career.
Right, right. At, you know, at age, let's see, it's 19, it was 1951, that was pretty good encouragement.
Then what about advertising? Because you went into that after college.
Right. I couldn't make a living as a full-time writer. I was still too green, and I look back at some of those stories that I wrote in the 50s for the pulp magazines, and I wonder how anybody published them, because they were not well constructed, the sentences were poor. I had to get a job, so advertising after college seemed a reasonable choice.
The first novel came along. You have it for us that we can take a look at today, The Texans Ride North.
Right. Actually, I wrote that during my senior year in college, during examination week. As a matter of fact, I was on tight deadline. It's a short book, children's book. Because I was an English composition major, I didn't have to take exams. I just turned in my stories. Therefore, I had a free exam week and I wrote the book.
What was that about?
It's about a young boy traveling north with the first cattle drives out of Texas after the Civil War. It's sort of, I guess you'd call it a historical piece.
How did it do for you?
It did very well at the time. I think it sold about 3,000 or 4,000 copies, as I remember. An average for a children's book. Never earned past its advance, never earned royalties, but I was very proud of it.
How did you like advertising as a career?
Well, I learned a lot. I learned how to write rapidly under a deadline, not always a good thing. I made a lot of good friends. I was glad to get out. My colleague, Elmore Leonard, worked in advertising in Detroit for the same major account that I worked on, and he felt the same way. And I said to him once, I said, well, what I really hated about it was I was making the client's mistakes instead of mine. I'd rather make my own mistakes. So when the opportunity presented itself, I was glad to depart.
The Kent Family Chronicles came along, I guess, when you were in a slump in your career.
Right. I had been writing for about 22 years with the results that we talked about, indifferent. And I thought, well, maybe it's really time that I just forget about it, quit trying to make a career as a successful writer. And then along came this offer from a book packager to do these 5 novels about an American family from 1776 to 1976. I said, well, I'll take a shot at it because it really is something I'm interested in history. I'll give it a try, and the rest is history.
It's an example, too, of how luck and timing is so important.
Exactly. Now, I speak sometimes to writers' groups, and they don't want to believe that. They don't want to believe that you make your own luck, but there's also the luck factor that exactly as you put it, being in the right place at the right time when the audience is ready. The American readers were ready for, I think, a kind of a positive presentation of American history. We'd come out of the Vietnam period, the bicentennial celebration was coming, the timing was right.
And also about the paperback factor, that these were going to be affordable books.
That's right. That was also at the time that the paperback industry was really booming, and they were beginning, the publishers were beginning to commission original works of some size and substance, and more important, to put money behind the promotion of them. And so all those factors came together in 1974 and carried on with the what I've always been very proud of about the Kent series is that those books were never reviewed, never, until the very end. It was the American reader from coast to coast, Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, that made those books by word of mouth. There wasn't any, there was no critical hype, nobody standing between the books and the reader.
And it was, do you think, that we just like reading about strong families?
I think so. In the midst of the Kent books, a sociologist from a university at a party told me that, well, part of the success of these books may be that families are beginning to disintegrate, and perhaps that gives an extra push to people wanting to read about strong families that survive tough times and family crises.
Well, back to the critics, what do you see as their role?
I think they're really kind of just guides to the reader when they do their job correctly. Some of them are simply substituting criticism for their failure to do something else. Most practicing writers don't think highly of critics. They think it's a fairly parasitical operation. But everyone who puts work on display in the public arena is subject to them. I will only say, how many books of 1890s reviews have you found at your local library lately? You know, the Dickens and Tolstoy and all the great 19th century writers are still there. I've been reading a wonderful biography of Balzac, who was repeatedly trashed by the critics, as was Zola, another one of my idols. So, you know, you tend to think kindly of the good reviews and try to forget the bad ones.
The people loved your books, and you loved, I know, bringing the history to them.
Well, I do. I take that responsibility very, very seriously. I don't want to sound pretentious about it, but I've always approached these historical novels as if they were the only shot at that piece of history a given reader might get. And I take the responsibility for keeping it accurate. I take that seriously.
The two adjectives that people keep using about your books is that they're entertaining and they're authentic.
I'm flattered.
Well, you have to be a good storyteller. That's one of your rules, right?
That's Patty, that's first and foremost. If you cannot get the reader to turn the page, you've lost the battle. That's the whole craft of storytelling, and every writer worth his or her salt does that first and foremost, in many different ways, but they still generate reader interest. Then I try to add to it an authentic historic portrait of the time.
That's what I was going to say. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how you come up with the characters and then weave the history in and you come up with this fantastic historical novel?
Well, it's a long process, and I really can't accurately describe how it happens. It's something, it's sort of like swimming or golf. If you do it a lot, you get used to doing it. I do make one rule. I never falsify history to suit the story. I try to find, through a lot of reading, what characters, what real people similar to mine were doing at the time, and then I try to construct the story so that the real people can weave in and out of the actual events in a logical way, never falsifying the history. And it's a tricky process, but apparently I've learned how to do it.
From the research end of it, you don't hire people to do it, you do most of it.
I do most of it. Now, I've used people to look for specific topics for me in the New York Public Library or to search out difficult books. But my theory, or my answer to the question, is that certain things interest me, and I'm not certain when I pick out a detail from a given period of history that a paid researcher would spot the same thing that I spot and would say, gee, that's kind of intriguing, I want to use that. I'm not sure that somebody who was hired could do that. So I'm very reluctant, and always have been, to release that part of the job. I like to do it. Besides, it's a lot of fun. I always say every new historical novel is sort of like another graduate degree in history, because I learn and learn and learn, right, as I'm constructing the story.
You have one little story about Jefferson Davis and about his blindness. Tell us that.
Well, that's an example of having a tough research problem. In the North and South books, of course, Jefferson Davis appears, and he had a bad eye. And I thought it was essential to know which eye it was, because I've worked with a couple of people who have sight problems, and it's rather embarrassing for both parties to be, you're wondering how do you look correctly without embarrassing anyone. Well, I found many a biography of Jefferson Davis that would raise the problem of his eye, but it wouldn't tell us which eye it was. Well, after a long search, I discovered which one it was, and was able to include that in the book.
Well, speaking of North and South, you're very excited now that the third part is going to be filmed.
Yes, I am, because it will complete the trilogy on film by the same producer, David L. Walper, by the same network, ABC. It is a different sort of story than the first two, in that it carries one of the characters, Charles Maine, the South Carolinian who fought for the Confederacy, out to the West right after the war, but it also carries the Reconstruction story forward, and I'm just delighted. It's been a long, hard sell in Hollywood on the part of the producers, but they have negotiated, and it's supposed to begin filming just in about a month from now.
How do you feel about the success of the earlier ones?
Well, I was, enormously gratified. I'm sure that if David Walper critiqued my work, he would find a lot of things he didn't like, but he wouldn't necessarily tell me. And I could probably find some things in the television shows that I wish they had done differently. But film is always an adaptation. It is not the literal book. So having worked in the theater and in advertising, I understand that collaborative process, and I'm delighted when there's a large audience for one of the television shows, because all that does is simply generate new readers for me. And if I have found through my mail that if the viewer does not like the television version, they don't blame the writer. They understand that Hollywood has its own rules.
You did so much research for that in the beginning at West Point, and to come up with the original idea of the mains and the hazards.
Right. I was really searching for, I decided on a trilogy about the Civil War, and I was searching for a device. I didn't know how I was going to write it. I thought it was going to be one military family. I couldn't decide which side it should be on. I was living in South Carolina at the time, and I read a book about West Point in which it talked about this incredible number of men who were high-ranking soldiers in the Civil War who knew each other as plebes and as cadets. And I said, there it is. And that, of course, led me to come up with the hazards from Pennsylvania and the mains from right up here in, near Charleston. And I see from recent television that they're still using that formula. They did a television movie a couple of weeks ago on the same theme. So that was just a lucky piece of research that set me down that road to the two families in the North and South books.
John Jakes has to set that standard. Can you read a little bit for us from North and South?
I will. Let me read just a few words about Charleston, in which Cooper Maine, who is Ori Maine's brother, who doesn't appear in the first TV show, by the way, has been exiled to Charleston for his views. He really is opposed to his father's views on slavery, so he's moved to Charleston. Cooper Maine loved Charleston. He loved its narrow, cobbled streets, which reminded many visitors of Europe. The expensive merchandise sold in its shops, the peal of bells from all the white church spires that had weathered salt air and sea gales for so many years. He loved the political rhetoric overheard in the saloon bar of the Charleston Hotel, the clatter of the drays whose drivers were constantly being fined for racing through the streets at dangerous speeds, the glow of the street lamps after one of the two municipal lamplighters, or one of their half-dozen slaves, had passed by, and he loved the house he had bought with some of the first year's profits from his shipping company. There was a vista he loved even more, the harbor and the great ocean beyond. Charleston Harbor remained one of the federal government's strongest coastal installations. Virtually everywhere you looked, there was a fort. Away on his left lay Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, and closer on a mud flat he could see Castle Pinckney. Straight ahead rose the bulk of Fort Sumter, and over on James Island, the forlorn old buildings of Fort Johnson. The various forts didn't thrill Cooper. What thrilled him day in and day out was the steamship traffic in the harbor. He had developed a profound love for ships and for the sea that carried them. The land at his back seemed old, frozen in a pattern fixed centuries before. The land was yesterday, obsolete or nearly so. But the sea, with all the restless steam vessels it bore, was a modern realm of speed, endless discovery, endless possibility. The sea was tomorrow. And in some unexpected, almost inexplicable way, Cooper had ceased to be a man of the land and had become a man of the sea. He loved that too.
What was your goal with this trilogy? What did you hope to achieve from North and South?
I really wanted to show the very deep emotional drama of this war, which many people, many historians consider the watershed of American history. It was the greatest readjustment of American social policy in the shortest time we've ever had. I wanted to try to delve into and understand the rationale on both sides. Such things as the number of people in the South who really were opposed to slavery, the bigotry of the Northerners after the war against the very blacks they had fought to free, there's a lot more to be told about the whole sweep of the antebellum period, the war, and the Reconstruction than what you get in the cliched versions. And that's what I wanted to do, to show the conflicts and the complexities.
Very powerful. Another example of your versatility is the book Susanna of the Alamo, which is a true story, and you collaborated with Paul Bacon on it. Tell me about that one.
Well, that's a book I did for HBJ, who published the North and South trilogy. Paul Bacon is probably the leading jacket designer in America. He did all the North and South jackets in California Gold. And we did a story for young people about the one American woman who survived the Alamo with her little daughter. And it's still in print. It's sold in the Alamo gift shop down in Texas. And I thought it came out very well. Paul's a wonderful artist. We had a good time with it.
The book after that you tackled California, 1989,
right,
California Gold.
Right. A story about the real wealth of a man who discovers the real wealth of California, not the gold fields where everybody lost their shirts, most of them, but the period of California history from about the 1880s, when the first land rush, the land development began, on through the orange groves, the oil wells, and ultimately the motion pictures. And it was a period of history I was interested in.
Story too of somebody leaving their what they've had, the familiar surroundings, going into something brand new and achieving.
Right.
Is that something that you'd like to write about?
Well, it is. I also think, you know, to be crass about it, it's a foolproof story. It's Charles Dickens, the little urchin up from poverty. I mean, you can't top it. And just because it's been done 100 times doesn't mean that 101 times it won't be terrific. Because you know, success is a wonderful. Struggling for success against terrible obstacles is a wonderful story, and it happens over and over in life, and so why not?
Right. Now the newest one, Homeland, you said most parallels your experience closest than anything.
Well, in two ways. It's really the story of a German-American family, and particularly in Homeland, of the immigrant experience. My maternal grandfather came to this country about 1870 from a small town in southern Germany. And he was alive until I was 7 years old, and I have a very vivid mental picture of him. Fine-looking man, white hair, distinguished imperial. And I always thought I'd like to write his story, and particularly I'd like to write about an immigrant from the standpoint of the German Americans, who contributed the largest number of immigrants to date that we've ever had in this country. I mean, there are lots. There are German colonies in South Carolina, great big ones. And the Germans have had a lot of problems over the years, as we well know, and there are some very dark sides to their character. But much like the Civil War books, it's exploring those complexities, the good and the bad, against the framework of the immigrant story that I particularly wanted to do, and that's what I did in Homeland.
Then you write about Chicago, your hometown.
Well, that's right. I was born and raised in Chicago, and I always had a desire to write a Chicago book, and I finally did.
This is the beginning of a new series?
Yes, it's the start of a new family who I hope to carry through major events of the 20th century. And I must say, for the readers who like to do detective work, all of the books, from the Kent books to California Gold to the North and South books to Homeland, are all connected. There are small clues as to whether one character is mentioned here. In California Gold, for instance, the protagonist uses George Hazard as a real estate agent from North and South. And of course, George went to California, and it works the same way in Homeland.
Okay, you've got my curiosity. I have to go back and read them all now. The Crowns of Chicago is this family, this dynasty that you write about. Right. Can you read us a little bit about Paulie, the youngest who comes to this country? This
is the moment early in the book when Paulie has endured his arduous journey through in steerage on an immigrant ship in 1892, and he is just coming into the harbor on a crowded ship. He's with an older immigrant named Walter, and they're looking for the Statue of Liberty. Suddenly, old Walter tugged his sleeve. "Look, Paulie, look, it's your picture postcard come to life." Paulie forgot everything except the sight of the Colossus rising ahead. In all his dreams, he had never imagined her so tall and mighty. She towered to the sky, seemed to float slowly and majestically toward him. The low-hanging clouds hid the island on which she stood, but he could see part of her base, a giant stepped pyramid of concrete, and above that, her pedestal of granite. Walter, too, was transported, reading eagerly from his little guidebook. The island is called Bedloes, an old army fort. She was placed there 6 years ago. She is the tallest statue in the world, 305 feet. That is 10 times taller than Michelangelo's statue of David. Paulie trembled as he gazed at her. Her robe and her face, her torch and her crown were agleam with rain. She was created by the sculptor Bartholdi, but her inner skeleton was designed by the great engineer Eiffel. Walter read breathlessly. There are 7 rays on her crown to represent the 7 seas and 7 continents. On the tablet, in Roman numerals, there is inscribed the date America won its independence, July 4th, 1776. In the ecstasy of the moment, Paulie twisted completely around to watch the statue moving astern. Walter peered at the little book. There are broken chains at her feet. She is striding ahead, free of the shackles of tyranny. We can't see that. We're on the wrong side and too low. The mighty statue floated away in scudding mist clouds. Germania, our mother, Columbia, our bride, Walter said. I heard that many times in Hamburg. Germania, our mother, Columbia, our bride. You grow up, you leave your family to take a wife. You'll always look back, but you can't go back. Rain dripped from Paulie's eyebrows, nose, and chin. He wiped his eyes. A lump filled his throat. Germania, our mother, Columbia, our bride. He wouldn't forget that or anything else about this momentous experience. Here in the new land, he would find a home, and a lifetime calling.
A great symbol of hope for everyone.
Indeed, yes, it still is. Still is. I went back there last fall on a final research excursion on a beautiful September day and found it just as inspiring as ever.
That period that you write about, 1890 to 1900 in this book, was at a time when the sky was the limit for this country.
That's right, and we were like a young person flexing new muscles and beginning to shoulder our way into the world as we'd never done before, pushing and shoving against the other great powers. Lots of things were happening. We asserted ourselves in this Cuba and the Spanish-American War. Many said that was super patriotism, that we shouldn't have done it. Many said it was done in order to save American investments in sugar plantations. Nevertheless, we did it, and that's a chapter of our history that Homeland explores along with several others. But it was a time of tremendous pride. In Homeland, I make a lot of use of John Philip Sousa's The Stars and Stripes Forever, which was written in 1897 and sums up the period in some memorable music.
The new book is called Homeland, due out in July. John Jakes, thanks for sharing your work with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Patti.
From Hilton Head, I'm Patti Just.